Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started now. Welcome to this ECCN webcast on the negative impact of peer violence and bullying on safe learning environments. I'm G.Heaner, the Research Manager for ECCN's support team. For anyone new to ECCN, we aim to improve practice in the area of education in crisis and conflict, particularly among USAID staff and partners. This webcast is made possible through our Partner Initiative program, through which ECCN member organizations have the opportunity to share important tools, research, and practice in EICC with the wider community. If you have something to share, you're in luck because ECCN currently has an open call for partner initiatives. You can visit our website for more information about that. Our agenda today, I'll provide a couple brief remarks about ECCN, and then we'll hear from Julie Hanson-Swanson and Kayleen Ressler of USAID Africa Bureau about peer violence and bullying in crisis and conflict settings. Then we'll hear from Shahryar Kabria and Jayun An from Texas A&M University about the relationship between school violence and student performance in Botswana, Ghana, and South Africa. And finally, we'll hear from Gustavo Payan from DAI Honduras, who will talk about addressing peer-to-peer violence and bullying in Honduras. Ashley Henderson of the USAID EICC team will make some remarks, and then we'll have an open Q&A where you all will have your chance to ask questions to the presenters. So first, regarding USAID Education in Crisis and Conflict Network, we're a forum for collaboration, networking, information, and knowledge sharing that USAID and implementing partners use to try to equitably increase access to education in crisis and conflict. We have four main priority areas: safer learning environments, under which this webcast falls, and also improved programming, enhanced equity, and stronger local institutions. We have a number of recent publications which will actually be addressed in these presentations. But one in particular I want to highlight is the SLE Toolkit, which helps us to try to measure risks to safe learning in conflict and crisis environments and try to program around those risks. We actually have an open call for teams who might be interested in piloting the quantitative portion of this toolkit. The qualitative has already been released. If you're interested in this, please get in touch with me for more details. You can also visit our website, iccnnetwork.net, for more information and follow our Twitter handle below. There's just a couple other updates I want to share with you before we get started. We're finalizing a white paper on the humanitarian development coherence. We'll have that document in early fall. And also we're planning a training with the Accelerated Education Working Group that will be in Uganda in November. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it along to our first presentation. And then we'll join you later for questions and answers.
Good morning, everyone, or afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. Thank you, Gwen, for that introduction, and thanks to ECCN for inviting us to this webcast. My colleague, Kayleen, and I will start things off by providing some general background information regarding violence in schools. So what we're showing now, several of you may be familiar with this matrix. This is a conceptual mapping of threats to safe learning environments created by the ECCN SLE Working Group. So as we know, children living in crisis and conflict settings face many barriers to their education. Schools may be destroyed due to conflict or natural disasters. Children may face threats of violence on the way to school, or they may be dealing with the trauma of losing a loved one at home. When considering all these barriers, it might be easy to overlook the invisible violence that occurs within the classroom. Among the types of violence that children experience in school and in the classroom are peer youth violence and bullying. Here are the WHO definitions for youth violence and bullying. So although we are focusing on peer violence and bullying today, please allow me to provide some broader context with the definition of school-related gender-based violence, or SRGBV. SRGBV is defined as acts or threats of physical, sexual, or psychological violence or abuse that is based on gendered stereotypes or that target students on the basis of their sex, sexuality, or gender identities. SRGBV reinforces gender roles and perpetuates gender inequalities. It includes rape, unwanted sexual touching, unwanted sexual comments, corporal punishment, bullying, and other forms of non-sexual intimidation or abuse, such as verbal harassment or exploitative labor in schools. Unequal power relations between adults and children and males and females contribute to this violence which can take place in formal and non-formal schools, on school grounds, going to and from school, in school dormitories, in cyberspace, or through cell phone technology. SRGBV may be perpetrated by teachers, students, or community members. Both girls and boys can be victims as well as perpetrators. Research shows that girls are more likely to experience psychological bullying, cyberbullying, and harassment. On the other hand, boys often face higher rates of physical bullying than girls. There is also a growing body of evidence that indicates that most LGBT youth report having experienced bullying or violence on the basis of their sexual orientation and/or gender identity or expression. So as we can see, the root causes of bullying and peer violence do not lie in one culture, tradition, or institution, but in wider structural issues, social norms, and deep-rooted beliefs and behaviors that shape gender and authority. And just to point out, wider structural and contextual factors include conflict, income inequality, deprivation or marginalization, and weak systems. As I just said, conflict and crisis are wider structural factors that can exacerbate violence. For example, in crisis and conflict settings, there are often high levels of family disintegration and a breakdown of community support systems. A lack of trusted adult figures may lead to students being afraid or hesitant to report school violence and bullying. In some country contexts, this cultural violence is also exhibited in the spillover effects of criminal gang violence in the school environment. A 2005 UNICEF study found that school bullying is often linked to inter-gang rivalry and trafficking of illicit drugs within schools. However, as we know, there is still limited data on prevalence of peer violence and bullying in crisis and conflict settings, since in humanitarian environments, most studies have focused on war-related violence, such as children being attacked by armed forces or physically injured with weapons, or physical abuse against children within the context of family or intimate partner relationships. So there is still not as much evidence on violence in school settings. So in October 2016, UNGAI, the UN Girls Education Initiative, and INEE, the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, launched a global survey to gather information on the prevalence of SRGBV in conflict settings. Although there were indeed several limitations to this study, we do see in this chart that 40% of respondents observed bullying happening daily or weekly in these conflict settings, and that was the most prevalent form of violence that was reported. So in addition to the negative psychological and physical effects of bullying, recent evidence has shown that bullying hinders children's ability to learn, which you will hear about later in this webcast. And now I'd like to turn the presentation over to my colleague, Kayleen.
Thanks, Julie. So Julie presented a great overview of peer violence and some of its drivers and the scope of the problem and the negative impact it can have on children. Now I want to talk a little bit about how we can address this issue. First and foremost, we need to begin to measure peer violence and bullying in the classroom. Having accurate data on peer violence is crucial so we can begin to design more effective interventions and to measure the impact of our programming. Luckily, there's a lot of tools out there that can help us capture this data. I just want to highlight a few. The Rapid Education Risk Analysis, also called the RERA toolkit, is a really great comprehensive toolkit that helps you conduct a systems-level analysis of the intersection of risk and education in crisis and conflict settings. Gwen earlier mentioned the Safe Learning Environment Qualitative Assessment Tool. It's a little smaller in scope than the RERA, but it's a really user-friendly tool that can be used at multiple stages of program design or adaptation to differentiate the different types of risk in your context. Also, the ECCN Evidence Gap
maps are a really good resource to find relevant research on peer violence or to identify gaps or opportunities for further research. The conceptual framework for measuring school-related gender-based violence has a great suite of survey instruments and implementation guidance that can be used flexibly for applied research or program evaluations. And this tool has modules on school climate and SRGBV that includes questions around bullying and peer violence. And then, of course, it's important to include project-level indicators that measure bullying and peer violence. ECCN on their website has a good list of recommended indicators, as well as the recently published INSPIRE indicator guidance. All right, so what works? Many of you know that there's no magic bullet when it comes to programming for peer violence. As we discussed in our last slide, these policies and interventions must be context-specific and based on rigorous situation and needs analysis. But that being said, there's a growing body of research on interventions that show promising results in reducing violence in the classroom. These interventions that I've highlighted on this slide are all from a recent rigorous review of global evidence on SRGBV interventions. And we see that at the student level, there's been a lot of effective group work approaches to bullying that include reflection on beliefs and stereotypes, recognizing and regulating emotions, communication and conflict resolution skills. We've also seen that youth gang involvement has been deterred through holistic community-based programs, which are also often paired with economic support or training. Teacher training has been found effective when it supports teachers' own reflection on their values, beliefs, and personal histories, as well as using interactive, inclusive curriculum and pedagogies. And then, of course, we recommend a whole school approach, that you have to engage the whole school communities, including leadership and administrative support staff, in developing and sustaining these policies, protocols, and practices. Just want to highlight a few more programming resources. You'll see the UNESCO Global Guidance on SRGBV. This provides a really great conceptualization of some of the issues, as well as some programming examples and best practices for when designing and implementing both prevention and response programs. The WHO just released their new INSPIRE handbook with strategies for ending violence against children. This is a really awesome resource that has that will help you choose and implement interventions that fit your needs and context. And they have a whole chapter specifically on working in the education sector. And then this last resource is the one I referenced in the last slide, a really great rigorous review of what works in SRGBV interventions. All right, and so a few key recommendations. First, we need to recognize and learn more about the gender dynamic of bullying and peer violence. How are boys and girls experiencing violence differently in the classroom? How can we better tailor interventions to meet their unique needs? It's also important to integrate prevention and response actions within schools and learning environments. And part of this means working within the larger system. So it's important to build the capacity of the ministry as well as other local partners and international NGOs, building their capacity to measure and recognize this violence and then design appropriate programs. It's also important to harmonize the efforts of the many different players working in crisis and conflict settings. So that's humanitarian, child protection, and development workers. And then, as I mentioned, we need to be measuring peer violence and bullying and generating more evidence on the scope of the problem as well as the impact of programming. Lastly, if you or your organization would like to become more involved in this community of practice, we recommend you join our global working group to end SRGBV. This is a really great platform for sharing research, tools, resources, best practices, and other advocacy materials. And if you're interested, you feel free to shoot an email to Julie or I, and we can put you in touch with the Secretariat. All right. All right, well, thank you very much. Now that we've kind of given you some background on the issue, we want to pass it over to our colleagues at Texas A&M, and they'll talk more specifically about their findings on how peer violence negatively impacts learning outcomes.
Thank you, Colleen. Howdy from Texas A&M. My name is Shariar Kibria, and I have my colleague G.Heaner with me. We are from Center on Conflict and Development at Texas A&M, where we try to provide data-driven evidence of pertaining to development solutions. In this specific case, we partnered with USAID Africa Bureau to generate evidence and shed light on the relationship of school violence and academic performance, specific to Botswana, Ghana, and South Africa. We have generated evidence through standardized learning performance and school bullying data. My colleague G.Heaner would provide some background of this study, and then I will talk about the results.
Thank you, Dr. Shariar. Let me just cover a little bit of background of the study. So as Dr. Shariar mentioned, our center partnered with the USAID to identify and quantify causal effect, that is how school bullying affects students' academic achievements or performance. And to identify these causal effects, we considered other social demographic and socioeconomic factors that may or may not influence academic performance of students. And based on the results, we provided the policy recommendation and implications. Next slide. So we have the main hypothesis, that is school bullying will impact male and female students' academic performance, as I mentioned. And then to investigate further, we got students' gender and socioeconomic background and teachers' gender and experience for students. And also, we also got the geographical information and the parents' education level. And next slide. The study is empirical. And then we consider PERS and teams. PERS stands for Progress in the International Reading Literacy Study. And that stands for more about literacy information. And the other one is Trends in Mathematics and Science Study, that's TIMS. And we got the information from here about the student numeracy score. And this is really large-scale data sets that the comparable study possible. And then the total participants we considered is South Africa, Botswana, and Ghana. And South Africa covers about 42% of the total study population, Botswana 38%. Ghana and is about 20%. And Dr. Shariar will explain more about the methods and the types of bullying. Thank you.
Thank you, Jayan. Before we move on, I just wanted to briefly describe the quantitative methodology that we used for this analysis. To verify and validate our estimates, we used several statistical analysis. The first one was ordinary least squares, which is basic regression analysis. Our dependent variable was bullying, and the main independent variable was student learning outcomes or academic performance. We had control for school demographics, parents' education level, parents' income level, and student-based characteristics. Then we use propensity score matching, which is a quasi-experimental method where we use bullying as a treatment to see if two students are alike in all characteristics, how bullying reduces, if at all, their academic performance. The third one is directed acyclic graphs, which originates from modern innovations of computer science. Directed acyclic graphs are computer-generated pictures representing causal independence. Simply put, directed acyclic graphs helps us to assign causal flows to a set of observational variables. In this case, directed acyclic graphs established bullying as a cause of lower academic performance. I think before we move on to the results, we need to, I know Colleen and Julie talked about the definition of bullying or definition of peer violence and how it's measured, but I will spend a little time describing how bullying was measured in this particular study. So the survey consisted of 6 questions. The students were asked during this year, how often were you made fun or called names at school? During this year, how often were you left out of games or activities by other students at school? During this year, how often did someone spread lies about you at school? During this year, how often was something stolen from you at school? During this year, how often were you hit or hurt by other students at school? During this year, how often were you made to do things you did not want to by other students at school? Now, these 6 questions were asked to all students, and the students who replied yes to at least 3 of them were identified as being bullied students. The significant observations in terms of how many students were bullying were not surprising, but concerning to the least. Approximately 80% of the surveyed students reported that they had been bullied monthly, and 50% of the students in the survey reported that they were bullied weekly. Here we have the graphs showing frequency of students that reported that they had been bullied weekly, and we do see no difference statistically across the 3 countries. Female and male students were bullied equally, and approximately, as we previously mentioned, 50% or half of the students reported that they were bullied weekly. Now, I'll go on and present some of the results. This is a graph showing the effects of weekly bullying in Botswana on academic performance. We present the propensity score matching estimates here. We show the spread and the average effect of bullying. For 8th grade science students, the effect is highest with 32% score decrease on an average. Just to put things into perspective, the scores mainly lie between 300 to 500. And for science, for 4th grade science, we can see that the average score decreased about 15 points. For math, it's 19. For reading and math for 4th grade students, it's 16 and 14 points. Next, we see the effect of bullying in Ghana on academic performance. We again show the PSM estimates. We only had data on math and science scores for 8th graders. And again, 8th grade math science students suffered the most with a 23-point decrease, while math students suffered as well with a 17-point decrease on an average. Next, we present the effects of weekly bullying in South Africa on academic performance. Here, we also have reading scores for 4th graders where an average student suffered about 25 points just because of bullying, while math for 8th graders show significant reduction as well, about 13 points. And science, again, science scores for 8th graders suffered the most. Here, they suffered by, on an average, 23 points. Again, summarizing our significant results and observations, impacts are greater for 8th graders. For bullying, science scores are most susceptible to the effects of bullying, reducing score by an average of 24 percentage points. While reading is most impacted in South Africa, reducing the average score by 16 percentage points. Math is most impacted in Ghana, reducing score by an average of 18 percentage points. The significant results and observations specifically are gender matters. In South Africa, we find that females are less affected by bullying. In Botswana, we discovered that females are more affected by bullying. In Ghana, the effects are trivial and we find no significant differences between males and females who are bullied. When controlling for bullying, academic performance is also influenced by sex, age, teacher's experience, parents' education, and geographic location. So specifically, students' sex, age, teacher's experience, parents' education, and geographic location are also found to be drivers of academic performance. But in all cases, bullying appears to be one of the most significant drivers of learning outcomes in all three countries. Conclusions, of course, our main conclusion from this study is that bullying is a significant factor in students' academic performance. And from this study, we conclude that mediating bullying may not be sufficient as in a cross-cutting approach, but bullying must be treated as an independent variable, and development programs should focus on reducing bullying to increase students' academic performance. Usually in development programs or education programs, bullying is considered as a cost-cutting effect, and the treatments are more geared towards enhancing education through teacher development or other types of treatment. Now, reiterating our conclusions and results, we suggest that the one-size-fits-all policy is problematic based on our results. Based on our research results, we provide some country-specific suggestions. In Ghana, we find that promoting female teachers and educating parents may be a treatment to increase students' academic performance. In South Africa, programs specific to school location that provide special assistance to students from challenged backgrounds may increase performance of students. In Botswana, gender-specific programs for females may mediate poor performances for students. Our future work or current work from the Center on Conflict and Development is trying to identify the causal directions and magnitudes of student and teacher perception of safety on learning outcomes in Rwanda, Tanzania, and Zambia through quasi-experimental analysis. So this specific work focuses on school bullying as opposed to our current work focuses on school safety and how the feeling of school safety can increase learning outcomes in Africa, specific to Rwanda, Tanzania, and Zambia. Again, reiterating our results, we find that school bullying significantly decreases academic performance measured by standardized learning outcomes. We also reach the conclusion that one-size-fits-all is not, or one-size-fits-all recommendations or policies are not recommended. And along those lines, we invite the next presenter to talk about bullying and peer-to-peer violence specific to Honduras and shed more light in terms of how peer violence is measured and peer violence affects performance for students in Honduras. I invite Gustavo Payan for his presentation. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Shahriar, for the presentation, and Julian and Kelly, very a great segue to my presentation. Thank you also, ECCN, for the invitation. It's great to see so many familiar names in the list of participants. And well, I must say that as a person who, as a kid was often bullied in middle school, this is a very personal and passionate issue that I'm working on. I want to start by, so my presentation is, I'm going to talk about our project in Honduras, funded by USAID, Asegurando la Educación, or Securing Education, and more specifically, addressing peer-to-peer violence and bullying in Honduras. I'm the senior technical advisor of the project, and deputy chief of party, and we'll get started. So moving from Africa to Latin America, I just want to provide a very brief overview. Latin America and Honduras and the Northern Triangle, which is the region, the sub-region in Central America comprised of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. The Northern Triangle is the sub-region in the world with the highest level of homicides and violence in the world. Plan International reports that 70% of children in Latin America are directly or indirectly affected by bullying. It is believed that the high levels of bullying and peer-to-peer violence mirror the environment in the communities, obviously. But it's also important to note the high levels of social inequality and discrimination. Julie and Kelly talk about gender-based violence, and obviously that includes sexual orientation, but also based on ethnicity and also towards students with disabilities. I also want to say that something important for our project is that Honduras recognizes this as a very critical problem that hinders education, and they passed a law called the Law Against School Harassment in 2014. So there's a lot going on in this slide, and it's in Spanish, so I'm not going to spend much time, but I just want to point out that peer-to-peer violence and bullying, we've been talking about it as the root cause of detrimental education outcomes, such as enrollment or retention or achievement, but it's an effect. So if you can, I don't know if you can see well, the box in the top, in the middle, it talks about physical violence, sexual and psychological among students and toward professors. It talks about discrimination among students based on origin and other forms of discrimination. And that is an effect of more complex structural challenges. So we can see at the very bottom issues like corruption, impunity, inequality, poverty, family dysfunction. And then primary causes, we see insecurity, presence of gang and other groups. So while it is true that bullying and peer-to-peer violence affect education outcomes, it is also the reflection of a more complex structural challenges. So situating the project in Honduras, it is funded by the mission, by the USAID mission in the country. USAID Honduras has 3 development objectives in its country strategy. And Asegurando la Educación, which is an education project, belongs to the development objective number 1, which is citizen security increase for vulnerable populations in urban high crime areas. So typically, I want to point that out because it's one of several education projects now that is part of the citizen security strategy. Whereas before, citizen security was approached strongly from the justice or law enforcement angle. And we see an increase of a larger space for education to play a role in citizen security, which is a good thing. And I hope that the trend continues that way. Also complex slide. And the point here is that the project, Asegurando la Educación, just a 5-year project. It's a systems, or use a systems-based approach. I think it was Kailin who mentioned that there's no magic bullet. Issues of violence, in this case, we're talking about peer-to-peer and bullying, but any type of violence has to be addressed from a multifaceted approach. We work, if you see towards the left, where it says school community, we work at the school level with the key stakeholders in the school, teachers, parents, teachers and other education personnel, administrators and counselors, students and parents. We work with, if you see at the bottom where it says networks, that's basically the surrounding community and other key stakeholders in the community. So we strengthen the relationship between school and their communities. We try to build what we call a social asset network so that schools and communities have a closer relationship, and we identify what may be service providers for specific cases of violence or because of trauma or needs for mental health, and the purpose is obviously to support education processes. On top, you can see SEDUC, which stands for Secretaría de Educación, or the Ministry of Education, and other government agencies. So not only with SEDUC at the central level, we actually have, after this, we have a meeting with the minister. There's a lot of interest in making sure that issues of violence are addressed properly in schools in Honduras. So there's buy-in at the top level, but we also work with most of the divisions within the Ministry of Education and our government agencies, especially related to child protection. And then we have USAID, other implementing partners that work in the DO1 sphere. We use a place-based strategy, so we'll work in the same community. So we have projects on democracy and governance, or economic growth, education, and there's a very intentional effort to coordinate with other implementing partners. Now, I'm going to show a couple of slides with data from our very recent baseline. We're still in the process of analyzing. The baseline was conducted a couple of months ago for two of our indicators, one that relates to perceptions of security by students, teachers, and directors, and the other about types of intensity of violence in schools. So here's just a graph with, I'm trying to contrast the way bullying and physical aggression is reported by teachers and by students, and the gap that exists between the two. So on the left, we see the bullying occurrence among students as reported by teachers. So we see a 52%, what says hombre in the yellow column is male teachers, how much bullying they report, and female teachers on the green. So it's pretty similar, the aggregated level in 66 schools in 5 cities in Honduras, so the 52% occurrence. Now, students report a 31% occurrence, and here we disaggregated the data by types of aggression, so physical, emotional, and cyber. Most of the students report a slightly higher emotional aggression. But what I want to contrast is the 52% versus the 31%. And there's a huge gap. And this coincides with the perception of security by students, which is extremely high. They feel safe somehow in the school. And what we are concluding is that there may be, or there is some level of normalization of violence. And what one may consider an aggression or a form of bullying, for many of the students is just normal occurrence, it's just day-to-day life, and they don't see it as such. So these are some of the things that were some of our hypotheses, and we're further studying a little more of this. Also, Shariar mentioned that that there's no one-size-fits-all approach, and I want to point out that we can look at the data from all the schools, 66 schools, and thousands of students who were surveyed, but we have to look as well at each individual school and the specifics there. So I pulled data from 2 schools. I'm not giving the names, So school A, where we see that male teachers report occurrence of bullying at 89%. And they say in a list of manifestations of bullying, which coincides with Shariar's, there's like 12 forms of bullying. They report that all of them occur except public sharing of personal information. Now, female teachers in that same school report the bullying occurrence at a 47%. So that's school A. School B, we have female teachers who report occurrence of bullying at 61%, and male teachers are 38%. Huge gap between genders of teachers and how they perceive or observe bullying occurring in their school. In school B, female teachers reported that forced to do things and threats were the most common forms of bullying. Now, my point with this graph or this analysis is that schools are very different and realities are very different. So we don't know what happens in school A that male teachers are observing much more bullying than female teachers. And that's something that the project is trying to support the school actors so that we look and analyze and understand more contextual information. Okay, I have 0 minutes and I have a couple of slides. If I may take 1 minute. With this slide, I just want to point out the very high levels of discrimination. 50% of students do not agree that students with HIV/AIDS should attend their school. 47% reject having LGBTI classmates, and 22% reject having classmates from ethnic groups. Just talk briefly about the project. 1 minute when I promise. It's as they said, it's no size fits all. It's a systems-based approach. I just wanted to illustrate a few of the types of interventions that we're doing in schools. I would say that our flagship program right now is Docentes por la Paz, which is a teacher professional development program based on I&E's Teachers in Crisis Context that uses a lot of USAID's Doorways program to address gender-based violence. We also have a Ganar Escuela, which is a sports-based program to develop social and emotional skills among students and promote social inclusion. And then at the national level, we work on right now, our main focus is two things: a strategy for the government to be implemented nationwide to address school-based violence, and the adaptation and implementation of protocols. What we have found is that teachers don't understand where their role ends, they try to respond to a case of violence, and they don't know how to do it. There's no guides in school, standard guides in the school. They don't know which authorities should be involved, and there's been a lot of cases where there's been further violence, or basically a do no harm approach principle is not applied. So we're working with at an interinstitutional level to develop these protocols and make them available for teachers nationwide. That's just a couple of examples. I'm going to finish my presentation. Sorry to be rushed. I get a little excited about this. Thank you, and I'm going to pass it on to Ashley.
So what I wanted to do is just situate our discussion about bullying and peer-to-peer violence in our education and crisis and conflict overall theory of change. So where does it fit? Of course, it fits in safety, which is one of 4 outcomes that we think are necessary to achieve our overall goal of increased access to quality basic education. So it's one of those 4 areas that Gwen alluded to earlier. The focus areas of ECCN correspond, of course, to delivery of education services, equity of education services improved, safety of learning environments improved, and then institutional capacity is strengthened. So just to situate our conversation more broadly in our theory of change, and then I wanted to go ahead and return to this great visual that you guys first saw in a slightly different color scheme in Julie's presentation earlier today, and remind you that, ECCN is working on an interactive theory of change that's going to flesh out those 4 sub-outcomes, that equity, service delivery, institutional capacity, and safety that I just showed you on the last slide, into more illustrative interventions and the evidence behind them. So looking more at sort of like interventions, drawing your attention to this slide here that we have in our safety framework. And there's going to be a lot of helpful resources coming, and I want you guys to stay tuned and be aware of that. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about safety looking forward for USAID education programming as we move into our new USG strategy and our upcoming education policy. Like my colleagues have demonstrated today, safety is incredibly crucial to effective education programming, and we are recognizing that, and even more so in education in crisis and conflict settings. So as we work towards programming, towards education outcomes and social and emotional learning, we understand safety as a prerequisite before achieving those outcomes. And we are hoping to increasingly emphasize that in the way that we measure our work as well. So we are working towards a new safety indicator at the global level. And I think that what you've seen from the presentation from our colleagues today have shown you guys, it's really tough to measure safety because safety is contextualized. In order to be effective, you need to make sure that you're tailoring your intervention to address the specific threats of those students in that school and that place. And we've struggled in the past to find a global indicator that both recognizes the importance of safety as a prerequisite to achieving education outcomes, but allows for the tailored interventions that make these interventions successful. So we're at that moment of that tough moment of creation, and we're looking forward to putting out something with the launch of our USAID education policy this fall. So stay tuned to ECCN and to us for that. And with that, I know we're behind on time. I'll pass it back to you, Gwen, for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Ashley, and thank you all presenters for all of the good work that you are doing on this theme. So we have Q&A now. We are going to keep the Q&A to the chat box, and so if you look at your screen here, there's a chat box, and you can type it into the text area there. Try to send to everyone so that we can see it, and I'll go ahead and mediate this discussion. We also had some questions that were given to us via the RSVP, so I'll just open up with a couple of those while you all can start typing your chats into the chat box. So Maddie Brensell from World Education has asked, I'd like to learn more about the intersection between bullying and crisis and conflict settings, which I think G.Heaner and Judy alluded to, but maybe you can comment a bit more, and specifically LGBTQ students who may suffer higher rates of bullying or persecution during these times. So I'll leave it to Julie and G.Heaner if you want to field that, and anyone else can come in, of course.
Well, hi, this is Julie. I think that is indeed the challenge that because different subgroups of education have been defining things differently. We don't know. In conflict, as I said, there is an emphasis on more of the immediate violence, which is apparent to everybody. Some of this bullying and these other types of violence are not as invisible to the eye as a school being attacked or teachers being killed. So right now, we are just starting to work with our colleagues in conflict to see how we can create that evidence base. And so this is a way that we are bringing together the work that we've done in Africa, looking at formal schools that are not in conflict settings, and to see how that can inform the work that our colleagues are doing directly in conflict.
And I'll just add that in that global review of evidence, there is some talk about specific studies and interventions that are targeted for LGBT students, but pretty much all of those studies have been done in developed countries, high-income countries. So I have yet to see a study that looks specifically about that population in crisis and conflict settings.
Great, thank you. So there's a clear evidence gap in this regard, so thank you for the question highlighting that. Another one that has come in through the RSVPs is from Julia Fraser at FHI 360. And I think this has been mentioned briefly in Shahryar and G.Heaner's presentation. But the question is, how are situations different for younger children and for youth? And so we had that evidence about the differences in learning outcomes. Maybe Gustavo, might you be able to comment in your perspective in Honduras on some of the things that you've noticed at this point for young people and younger children and youth?
Sure. Well, we're trying to make that distinction, or I didn't talk much about the project, but we are working with children and youth ages 10 to 16, 4th to 9th grade, basically, and ages vary. But it's very different how we can address a 10-year-old or an 11-year-old versus a 15 or 16-year-old. So going back to the question about LGBTI, for instance, it was hard to ask that question, sort of bring data that helps us understand how LGBTI or children who may identify as LGBTI are bullied because of the sensitivities. So it's definitely a challenge. We also work with different systems, with different types of education institutions, those in middle school and those that cover basic education. And there's different types of resources available as well. So some of the institutes that have higher education have the figure of a counselor in the school, which is a great help to support future interventions like cognitive behavioral therapy, for instance. Whereas at basic education centers do not have that figure anymore because of resources in the Ministry of Education. So we're actually lobbying to have that reinstated. So it's very nuanced. Right now, the approach at a broader level is sort of the same with schools, but then the specifics when we work with kids, we will continue to sort of tweak the types of questions we ask. Whether we for all of them are minor, so we need approval from parents for basically participation in anything and any survey. So that's so far what I can say about age differences in terms of the programmatic implication.
Thanks. We had another question from Tracy for Gustavo, and she'd like to ask you to tell us a bit more about how you're working with the young people, specifically using sports, and if you have any examples of what this looks like in that context.
Right. So we're rolling out a program called A Ganar Escuela, or School to Win. It doesn't really make a lot of sense in English, but this is based on a program that is very well regarded by Partners of the Americas called A Ganar, which was originally intended, or in the original version is more about life skills, work readiness skills, and workforce development. And we're working with them to adapt and promote social and emotional learning through mostly soccer, but there's other forms of physical activity as well. So, the program, if anybody knows A Ganar, is very similar, but the way it is, but the reflection process is facilitated is different. So there's different types of questions. In summary, children are playing with different rules, playing soccer with different types of rules, in teams with different types of hurdles, different rules applied to different teams, and that sparks different emotions and reactions in children, which then are used in a reflection process for increasing consciousness of self-awareness, social awareness, relationship skills, and that sort of thing. So we're in the process of rolling out the first version. We'll have some interesting data at the end of the year.
Terrific, thanks. We have another question in the chat box from Kathleen Adams. She asks, I'm wondering what type of research is being done on the bullies themselves or the perpetrators of school violence. In particular, conflict as well as crisis can have traumatic impacts that sometimes manifest as violence. Then as a child or youth enacts that violence, they actually begin to feel worse and worse about themselves and may become more isolated. So is anyone looking at that cycle and its impact on learning and achievement, or doing interventions that account for that cycle? I'll open that up to anyone.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think there's been a lot of research done about the cycle of violence and how witnessing violence or experiencing violence in different ways can lead to you becoming a perpetrator yourself. I haven't seen any research that specifically looks at that intersection with learning or achievement. I don't know if any of my colleagues have seen that. This is really kind of a new area, kind of looking specifically at not just like educational outcomes as far as retention or dropout, but looking at actual achievement scores. This is kind of a very new area.
Yeah, it's a real frontier issue. Now, there are anecdotal stories of bullies who have participated in bully prevention or just in general violence prevention programs, and later they become strong advocates and become, well, I guess not quite positive deviants because they were people who perpetrated violence, but then because of their experience, they can often be very credible role models who can talk about why they chose to change their behavior, and they can be really good role models. So I think there is probably anecdotal evidence, maybe some qualitative literature about that, but what you've mentioned is indeed issues that have yet to be addressed systematically.
And we encourage you all to go out and research these issues.
Absolutely.
Yes, we here are not aware of any quantitative research specifically from developing countries on bullies or students who have bullied themselves. The challenge may be collecting the data because it would be hard to get information from students that if they have bullied themselves. And it also may be hard to collect quantitative data and design surveys on issues of why students have been bullying other students. And if there is a psychological cycle in terms of getting bullied and becoming a bully, and what are the negative implications of getting bullied yourself and then pushing back even. So it is a valid research question, and I think it should be looked at, and we'll try to collect data in future studies on this issue.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. We've just hit 12 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and close. You can see on your screen here, there's a couple more resources if you want to continue this conversation. We have a website devoted to this webcast where you can find all of the resources that have been mentioned today. Today's slides and its recording will be made available in the next 5 business days. And of course, if you want to follow anything else that ECCN is working on, please register for a free account at the web address you see on your screen here. And I'm sure any of the presenters would be happy to be in touch. They provided their messages or their emails in the presentation. Thank you all for joining. We appreciate your time, and thank you presenters also for your illuminating presentations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.